Di sicuro sta impattando con l'acqua alta, come è successo a novembre.
Ma in generale un sacco di plastica ovunque.
Anche nei canali, quando si passa in barca, ce n'è sempre di più, soprattutto adesso d'estate che stanno tornando i turisti. È stato bello durante la quarantena perché cioè, ad esempio si notava con l'acqua che era molto più pulita e senza il moto ondoso.
Si sa bene, poi è abitudine delle cose, in tutte le cose è un'abitudine. Sia nel caldo, nel freddo, con l'acqua alta, è tutta un'abitudine.
Siamo stati colpiti anche da un'inondazione molto grande, però come sempre i veneziani, noi che ormai siamo nati con l'acqua alta, viviamo, ci conviviamo, abbiamo passato anche quel scoglio, sopportiamo tutto su un cambio climatico. Qui il problema grosso è solo la burocrazia.
If we want to see positive things about the virus, we saw that in like 2-3 months the nature take its spaces back. So water is more clear. You see birds leaving eggs all around, even ducks here.
For me, important is also this Fridays for Future, because during the lockdown, the skies were clear and no planes, and the air was breathable.
Per quanto riguarda l'aeronautica, ieri in particolare, gli studi vanno sia sulla struttura dell'aereo ma soprattutto sulla motorizzazione, quindi fare motori sempre più efficienti a basso impatto ambientale.
Le Covid, c'était la meilleure solution pour que les animaux aillent mieux, qu'il y ait moins de pollution. Il y a des solutions, mais les gens justement qui roulent en voiture ne veulent pas changer leur perception de la vie. Et tant que les gens ils ne regarderont pas plus devant, ça ne changera pas.
We are talking about climate as a crisis for how long? Maybe 30 years, maybe even more. When you're trying to deal with the climate crisis in a proactive way, I think like green tourism or the debate how we can cooperate across borders to be more sustainable.
There we are giving a huge aid of 8,000 euros for those who want to buy a new electric car, for example. So this is like a very concrete example that we don't want to give out just money like that, but we link it to ecological criteria.
Justement, rester local. Mais alors, quand je dis ça, surtout pas se renfermer. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'il n'y aura pas de transport, de grands transports ou quoi, mais au maximum, rester local. Il y a deux populations. La population qui a encore un pouvoir d'achat assez conséquent veut vraiment se tourner vers encore plus de local. Et donc, ce sont des produits qui sont un peu plus chers, hein, forcément, puisqu'ils sont produits ici, localement. Et on a la deuxième partie de la population qui, elle, n'a toujours pas, et peut-être a même perdu du pouvoir d'achat, qui, elle, cherchera toujours les prix et toujours voilà, le moins cher, de chez moins cher, de chez moins cher.
We, as humans, are powerful, intelligent species, and then at the same time we should also remember that we are not the only ones who have the right to live on the planet Earth. And that's made me turn vegetarian.
It's small things like if we don't have bees and we don't have birds and we don't have fish. I see the small things which concern me personally. I cannot care so much for the big, which are, of course, more important and, let's say, more dramatic.
Hello everyone, my name is Simone Tagliapietra. I'm an Energy and Climate Fellow at Bruegel. Today I am delighted to moderate this session of our annual meetings devoted to the issue of green recovery. Yesterday, in the first day of our annual meetings, we had the opportunity to hear from Frans Timmermans about the issue of green recovery, about the intentions of the European Commission of doubling down, as he said, on the Green Deal in the post-COVID phase, about the need to reconcile the short-term economic impacts we need from the recovery plans to the long-term climate goals. And therefore, building also on what we listened to yesterday, which you can always access in our Bruegel website if you missed it, we today dig a little bit into the, let's say, more technicalities of green recovery to understand if and how greening a recovery is feasible. Over the last months, we have indeed assisted to building political momentum on delivering a post-COVID-19 green recovery. However, we know that the rationale is clear. We need to seize this moment of profound disruption in which countries are injecting billions into their economies, in which the private sector is rethinking its business models to reorient our economy towards a sustainable pathway. But we know that greening the recovery also has trade-offs. As we said, there are short-term needs to push growth, to create jobs, which might seem from time to time to be aligned, but also conflicting with more long-term societal objectives, such as decarbonization. So it should be, the policy mix should be very carefully crafted. And this is what we are going to discuss today with our distinguished panel that will help us all to navigate these uncharted waters. The panel is composed by Samantha Smith, the director of the Just Transition Center at the International Trade Union Confederation, by Barbara Frei, the executive vice president, Europe operation of Schneider Electric, Stephen Fries, the chief economist of Shell, and Georg Zachmann, senior fellow at Bruegel. Before starting our panel, let me provide you some housekeeping remarks. First of all, we will have a round of interventions and kick-off messages from our panels. We will then move into a question and answers session. Of course, in this virtual environment, we try to do our best to engage with our audience, virtual audience, all of you. If you want to pose a question, just go to Slido and with the code BAM20, feel free to ask whatever question you have to our panel. Always in Slido, you can also access a poll we created to also hear your voice on this critical issue. And the question we pose you is the following. What is the best policy tool to deliver a green recovery? You have three options: green investments, green conditionality to state aid, and carbon pricing. Feel free to pick your preferred option. We will discuss the results of this poll at the end of the panel with our speakers. Without much further ado, I would immediately turn to Stephen, asking you, Stephen, what's your take on the political economy of green recovery? Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Simone, and thanks to Bruegel for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion. So you've asked about the green recovery. So let me begin with the recovery first, and then turn to the green elements and explore, as you rightly say, where the interests in the two align very strongly. So clearly, we're currently at a juncture in the current economic crisis where the initial emergency responses to the public health and economic crisis are giving way increasingly to recovery that looks more typical of other recessions and recoveries. We're seeing incomplete bounce backs from the deep lockdown troughs, and they're beginning to reveal some of the permanent enduring structural consequences of the pandemic. particularly in consumer-facing sectors and sectors of shared public services. So the challenge in the next phase of the recovery is to continue to minimize these scars, begin reallocating resources that are needed to get us back to potential output, and to support demand spending and investment towards sustainable growth. So we're increasingly reaching a point in the crisis and recovery where the green elements are going to become increasingly important. This investment spending in the recovery and resource allocation must be able to reasonably quickly create jobs for the unemployed and to direct resources increasingly towards sectors that are expecting to grow in the long run. And there are two long-run drivers that are important to bear in mind in structuring the next wave of recovery supports. One are the enduring structural changes from the pandemic, and of course the other are the unchanged imperatives for decarbonization. So the timeliness of investment spending, its material scale, and its sustainable direction of resource reallocations are all key to greening the recovery. So now let me give you some concrete examples in each of the main energy sectors where there are opportunities for meaningfully greening the recovery. And let me begin with the building sector. And here I'm in incredibly strong agreement with what Frans Timmermans had to say yesterday. So if you look carefully at the nature of the enduring consequences of the pandemic and its implications for changing the way we work, the way we're meeting today, the way where we choose to live, and how we choose to shop and consume services, all of these things are going to change, and these are really accelerations of trends that are underway from the digitalization of the economy. And in this context, I think many buildings are likely to need to be repurposed in the recovery to reinforce the structural change and the reallocation of resources. And it's vitally important as these buildings are repurposed and refurbished that they're also become green buildings in the process. We know that these are critical opportunities for the transformation of the built environment. So I think this, if I were to put it at the top of my list, where there's a win-win between greening the recovery and accelerating us back to full employment, I think this is clearly one area to focus. And how can you do this? Of course, you can do it through government public investments in government buildings, including social housing, as well as time-bound fiscal incentives for the private sector to invest in greening their buildings. But you can also look at other examples in other sectors. In electric power, for example, there's clearly scope for investments to build out power grids, particularly to reach renewable rich regions, be it offshore in Europe or the interior regions in China. And also to invest in upgrading infrastructures to integrate more effectively both variable renewables and their complementary flexibility technologies. So I think this is another clear area for a prioritization of investment spending. And of course, we know in these macroeconomic consequences that the spending multipliers from particularly spending on investment are quite strong. You can catalyze significant other private investment, and you're also reorienting the economy towards its long-run growth potential. You can look in the transport sector, and here I think the story is a bit more complicated. Clearly, the automobile industry is accelerating very rapidly its capacity to produce battery electric and alternative drivetrain vehicles. But this sector is bumping up against, I would say, its short-run capacity constraints and how much more we can accelerate this development simply, at least in the context of the recovery horizon. Certainly in the longer run, there's significant scope. But in the transport sector, there might be, for example, greater potential to focus investment on expanding the charging infrastructure for battery electric vehicles that lowers the switching costs for customers as capacity for alternative drivetrain vehicles expands. And then lastly, let me touch on the industrial sector. And here, I think an important focus would be looking where you can have significant demonstration projects, for example, material demonstration projects in the production of clean hydrogen, or indeed in accelerating investment in CCUS infrastructures, particularly in industrial clusters, for example, in Northeast England or Rotterdam in Europe. And I think there's, again, a potential for a win-win where these projects are well in advance in preparation, and there's scope for implementation and acceleration in the context of the current recovery. So hopefully these are some concrete and practical examples of how we can green the recovery, primarily through an acceleration of public and private investment in transforming the capital stock. These are clearly the right directions at the right time, both in terms of the recovery and the climate imperatives. But clearly there's more to do, both in greening individual country ambitions and having a really strong laser-sharp focus on implementation. And of course, all of this has to be done within the usual macro constraints, particularly around fiscal sustainability, obviously adapted to the current context. So I think those are the key points that I wanted to share, and to say that we strongly support this direction of greening the economy, and appreciate the opportunity to share these few thoughts on the issue. So thank you, and I'll turn the floor back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen, for this very comprehensive view on concrete policy interventions that can be undertaken to deliver a green recovery. Buildings, power grids, charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, industrial sector demonstration projects spanning from hydrogen to CCUS are indeed the key components of our discussion this month. Now, it is clear also from your talk, Stephen, and from also what we heard yesterday from Franz Timmermans, that the buildings are at the center of the attention. Everybody's looking at buildings like the sector in which the green recovery can really be achieved in the best manner. I would then like to turn now the floor to Barbara to ask if we are ready to deliver on these smart buildings revolutions. Is the technology there? And in case, how can the public and the private spheres interact to deliver this renovation wave or this massive action on buildings? Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone. So, yes, technology is already available to deliver a green recovery. We have solutions in place coming from many years of strategical decisions around sustainability and also digitalization. So we have invested a lot into R&D and also into specific acquisitions to get more complete there. We have a high attention to solutions that are critical to ensure a systemic efficiency in the way we manage the energy transition. And by systemic efficiency, we mean efficiency from a holistic point of view, rather than from a given just product, asset, sector point of view, where you look at it in an isolated way. The already existing technologies are, however, simply not yet widely used. You can build already today a zero-emission commercial building, but it has not been on top of the mind of the investors to look into a sustainable CO2 emission reduction path. However, I'm convinced, based on feedbacks and leads within the market, that decision makers in larger companies take sustainability as a priority topic to ensure a resilient business. We see this as a confirmation of our strategy of deploying our portfolio as quickly as possible once it has reached a certain level of maturity, also on our own assets and infrastructure. This creates for us, of course, additional learning with regard to our own range of products and services, but also is giving the necessary market advantage. So we are really able to eat our own food, so to say. In order to anticipate a possible question, yes, it sometimes also takes a little courage to do these kind of things. Basically, digitalization and sustainability will not only be the key to be more resilient and decarbonization, they are also the foundation from our point of view for economic and social development, which we owe to the present and all the future generation. And for us, it is very clear the Green Deal and the EU recovery plan are a critical opportunity for us now in Europe to accelerate this. So that brings me to your second question. How should the private and the public sphere interact to deliver? And maybe to word it a bit more concrete, what is actually the starting point from which the right short-term economic impulses are set? And we, the industry, can also benefit from them, but also and especially realize the medium and long-term transformation. To accelerate the transition to more a sustainable future across the board, I see the following key areas at focus that will activate a systemic efficiency. First, introduce optimization measures to reduce energy demand across industry, buildings, and transportation, including solutions for heating and cooling. These are the great energy contributors usually in a building. Then accelerate electrification of buildings, industry, and transport, which is powered by clean and renewable energy. We need digitalization to enable flexible use of infrastructure, both from a demand and supply side. And last but not least, the circularity of materials, in particular for buildings. Why do we want this? Generally, Europe is in the middle of the road, and we must accelerate the efforts in almost all fields, also by enabling the industry with dedicated frameworks and policies. Europe must play, from our point of view, a leading role here. The Green Deal at its heart is the growth strategy towards a resilient, resource-efficient, and competitive economy. In Europe, we need to ensure a greater level of harmonization, looking at decarbonization and digitalization. So we can see, for instance, Northern Europe rather in advance, generally speaking. But even in the leading pack of the countries, we need stronger efforts. Only in the interaction between politics and industry lies the strength for implementation. The political bodies create the responsible framework, and the industry demonstrates and proves its strengths by breaking new grounds and developing its own technologies with the corresponding economies of scale, which is really a key topic for Europe. We need ambitious policy measures to activate a stronger market signal at the economy, and this must accelerate the decarbonization path. Most importantly, those policy measures must ensure we invest both in decarbonization and innovation. This is why we refer so much to systemic efficiency, because it allows economy of scale and innovation across the border. So ambitious target set is important from 220 to 250 for the CO2 reduction, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. The recovery plan needs to prioritize decarbonization and digitalization. At the same time, we also need to ensure that we invest in innovation here in Europe. And we need a sectorial roadmap to ensure it's going to be deployed. Private players shall be for sure part of it. And now I'm coming to the same example like Stephen that I like to mention here, and it's buildings. Buildings are Europe's single largest energy consumer, accounting for approximately 40% of the energy consumption in Europe. Our internal estimates for forecast it could go up to 50% if we include construction industry and its upstream value chain. Europe has many strengths in this area with leading local players, construction industry, technology providers, utilities, service business, and specialized software companies, covering the whole spectrum of the value chain. What to do now? We need to target non-residential buildings renovation, which represents a high opportunity. We also need a breakthrough level of smart electrification and deep building efficiency that could save up to 23 billion on energy bills, leading to the net creation of potentially 1.8 million jobs in Europe. And we need to triple the renovation rate to achieve our decarbonization goals in buildings. So from our point of view, the digital and green transformation is the only way to stay competitive, attract talents, and also to stop the climate change. So the European economy have the unique opportunity here to take a leading role in this global context. And I would like not to go into the same dynamics we were until 2008. We never really recovered after 2008. But I think now we have a different thinking in Europe. And this is a golden opportunity to turn around the effect of the pandemic and not become a new offset again for Europe. So thank you. Looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Barbara, for these insightful comments on the issue of buildings and their role in the recovery. Your points on the importance to foster the renovation wave in Europe are very well taken, I think. And thank you also for mentioning the parallelism with what happened after the great financial crisis in 2008, because maybe we can come back later to this point during the debate, but certainly there are lessons learned we can use this time from that experience, since green recovery was also back in time high on the agenda, but maybe the result was not really successful back then. So today's situation is very different under so many different aspects, but certainly some lessons learned from that could be useful today. I think policymakers face today with the need to foster policies that basically have a triple win. We know the economic growth, the greening, but then there is the fairness dimension. And the fairness dimension is very important given the policy focus on reducing inequalities in our society, which needs to be undertaken, particularly in this moment in which, as we know, many people are being affected by the economic consequences of COVID. Let me turn to you, Samantha, to discuss this issue, asking if a green recovery can also be a just recovery for workers and for communities. How can we make this happen? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simone, and hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. I mean, I'll just start by quoting one of our Canadian trade unionists who said that it can't be jobs versus the economy. It's going to be both or neither. Or sorry, jobs versus the environment. It will be both or neither. I work for ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the global federation for most of the world's unions. We represent more than 200 million organized workers in 162 countries. And I am going to speak much more to the political part of political economy in this discussion. I'm the director of the Just Transition Center, which was set up by ITUC and its partners in response to the Paris Agreement on climate change and the International Labor Organization's adoption of global rules on just transition. And just transition, in case you're not familiar with it, is basically all of the things that we now need to do in Europe and globally to bring down emissions, get people back to work, and provide social protection, including both healthcare and income support and education and skills. We help unions and their allies get good plans on just transition. These are always based on social dialogue with unions, employers, government, often communities at the table. This can be everything from a collective bargaining agreement to the sector agreements we've just heard discussed, to city or regional plans or regulations, or even a national process or law. I want to say a couple of things about just transition and tie it to this discussion about the current crisis. just transition works. So we have evidence from a number of countries, some but not all of them in Europe. You need organized labor to manage a transition of this scale and speed. And probably the best agreement of how this works so far is the agreement to transform Germany's power sector, phase out coal, revitalize Germany's coal-producing regions, and make sure that no one is left behind. In contrast to you, Stephen, our sense is that we're still in a pandemic, and it is still the biggest global public health crisis in more than 100 years. And though many of us may be, who feel as if we're done with the crisis, it is not done with us. There are signs that the economic crisis is easing, but it may be premature to talk about a recovery. We're still, to a great extent, in response and stimulus mode. I mean, even more importantly for working people, this is a jobs apocalypse. Globally, more than 300 million jobs were lost between April and June. In Europe, in the same period, more than 5.5 million jobs lost. It's a crisis of both supply and demand. And if we, look at our people, so not only organized workers, their families, other working class people are angry, they are desperate, they are scared. Somewhat less so in Europe due to our social protection systems, but nonetheless, there are millions of people unemployed across the region. And in any discussion about responding to this crisis, their concerns have to be front and center. Their work, their jobs, their consumption are the things that are going to drive a recovery or not. And just to say a bit about where people are and how that connects to the politics. I mean, if you were employed in February, you just want your old job back. And if you weren't employed, say if you're a recent graduate, you are really frightened now because there are no jobs. So what that means is that on the one hand, we shouldn't overinterpret stimulus packages so far that are going to polluting industry. In a lot of countries, politicians, employers, unions, they're just trying to respond to what people want by switching on the economy we had in February. What it does mean is that a green recovery, for example, the European Green Recovery Package, it has to be a just recovery. It has to involve a just transition. Labor has to be at the table in negotiating the package and how it gets rolled out. It has to create good jobs, and it has to be underpinned by social protection. So good jobs, social protection, especially health and income support, these are top priorities for every working person. They have to be front and center. What we can't have is what we got in 2008 and some of what we have seen on the climate front in other countries. We can't have top-down targets without jobs or social welfare. We can't have programs that weaken labor laws and create lots of insecure jobs with poor wages and conditions. We can't have a return of austerity for public services and public employment. So we say where I come from, this ain't it. And we're going to get a political backlash bigger than what we have seen so far if we can't have a different approach now in Europe. I completely agree with you, Barbara, that we absolutely have the technology, the know-how, the industrial base, the opportunities in different sectors to get a green recovery and a just transition, particularly, but not only here in Europe. But in addition to all of the things that have been discussed, we have to have the social policies that back this up. We have to have an industrial strategy, sector strategies that are matched with social policies and strategies. And we know what social policies work in these situations. We know we need, again, social protection, income support, active labor market policies, labor rights, social dialogue, public investment, public services. If we're going to get a green recovery, it can't just be in Europe. It has to be as global as possible. Right now, looking at what's going on politically in different countries, so far, Europe is the place where we have the most hope for and the best chance of getting this. We may, depending a bit on political developments, get other big green recovery packages in other countries. That would be a best case outcome. There are other outcomes for which we should plan in Europe. I want to say 2 words about the European package so far, right? Because it now has to go through a political discussion in the Parliament. there are many things that are good about what was agreed. But what is less good is that funding that was focused on workers, on European industry, on just transition got left on the cutting room floor. And that's everything from funding for the just transition mechanism to the Globalization Adjustment Fund. So this is also not the future that we want. If we want a Europe that is leading on low emissions industry, that is able to export its technologies and products around the world, that has a strong basis for trade negotiations that include climate and labor policies, we're going to have to do better in this green recovery package. Two last things before I close. We haven't said anything about oil and gas, but yet, you know, if we look again globally, and Stephen, you'll know this better than I do, the industry is in crisis, right? The bottom has fallen out of demand in a lot of countries. There's also, you know, sort of geopolitics around oil supply, OPEC, and so on. And without getting into that, I'll just say that from the perspective of our many millions of members who are employed in oil and gas and its supply chain, it's not that they are opposed to change or to a just transition. What they want is they want companies to remain prosperous, thriving, and employing people, and to take their workers with them if they're going to transform and bring down their emissions. And that obligation to shift portfolios, to go boldly into sectors that have long-term legs as well as having short-term jobs, that has to rest with the employers, and it should be done with organized labor. When it comes to construction and buildings, infrastructure, building renovation can indeed create millions of jobs in Europe and globally. But there's a tendency to think that, you know, these can be insecure, poorly paid, unsafe jobs without skills. Actually, if you're going to renovate a building to zero emission standards, that's a highly skilled job. You need workers who are appropriately skilled and compensated. What we don't need is labor dumping and a bunch of insecure, low-paid jobs in this critical sector. So to conclude, if I were going to take this poll that you've put out, I might go for public and private investment, but my top pick is actually not on the list. And that would be to add labor standards to every single target and package, because again, we can't choose between avoiding climate change and jobs. It really has to be both, and those jobs have to be good jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha, for reinforcing this point of the need to find policies that basically match the growth requirement, the jobs requirement, the green requirement, and the fairness requirement. Of course, if we just look at our discussion, we see that there are many requests. From the one hand, we hear we need more for the renovation. From the other hand, we can hear we need more for the just transition. Other people would say we need more for this kind of investment, for another kind of investment. So there are many requests to deliver on this, and the resources are at the end limited. Now, Georg, this limit to the recovery funds we have at our disposal and the eventual need to go beyond the only greening of the recovery plans to also, let's say, play with expectations of market players and therefore use the carbon pricing tool to also drive the green recovery on top of greening. Absolutely. The recovery plans was at the center of a publication we did at Bruegel just before the summer. And let me then take this opportunity to ask you if you want to share some of the key messages we had back in time, and overall, what's your take on this discussion? Georg, the floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks, Simone. So indeed, I would like to make the argument that a lot on the success of the green recovery will depend on long-term expectation building. And I agree with a lot of what has been said, especially the presumption that investment in decarbonization is needed for climate reason and will be a contribution to the recovery. So investment is indeed something that that we should talk about here today when we talk about green recovery. The question is, which investment projects do we want? And we had a couple of examples discussed already. And the other question is, how can the government unlock those that we think are useful? And I would argue, maybe a bit more controversially, that the volume of no-regret green recovery projects that can be deployed by just employing public finance is more limited than we might think. And the reason for that is that a lot of the projects that one can support publicly to bring them over the line lack one of the elements that are needed for green recovery. So there are a lot of projects that are great, but that cannot be deployed fast enough. So we talk, for example, about a European railway system, but that will take probably more than 10, 20, 30 years to develop. It's not something where a lot of money can be brought in immediately. We talk about we talked about a lot of energy efficiency investments in private and public buildings. Yes, a lot can be done and must be done, but in some countries we currently have a capacity overuse already, or are close to the capacity. So in my country, in Germany, it will be quite difficult to find people that are going to essentially deliver that quickly. So capacity underuse is a necessity to make a recovery program useful. Then for a couple of projects, it will be quite difficult to ensure that there is additionality of this project. So we can throw a lot of more money on, say, certain renewable types, but a lot of this money will essentially increase prices without immediately leading to higher amounts of deployed capital, and in terms of more jobs being created. It will first go into the prices, and it might take beyond the current crisis to roll out. Then another criteria is value chain effect. So we don't want to invest in projects that are based entirely on imported capital goods. So we don't want to just install Chinese produced PV panels. We want certain projects that have significant value chain implications throughout Europe in order to increase the multiplier to levels that are helpful to the recovery. And finally, a lot of policies have the problem of certain crowd out, especially if you think about it in a European level. So if in one country, say Germany, a lot of renewables are deployed, and all the renewable installation types then go to Germany, then the auction prices in other countries might not be attractive anymore, and you won't get any new builds there. So we have to do some European coordination here to avoid that such crowd out effects just appear based on public finance here, because overall they wouldn't stimulate the European economy as much as needed. So I would argue it's very important to look into individual projects to understand what is holding them back. So we really need an understanding. We have these nice smart housing renovation projects that I would fully back, or transmission building projects that Steve mentioned that they are also fully back. And we have to understand what is holding those individual things back. And very often it's not direct public finance, lower interest rates, but it's other regulatory tools. And we need to be, as Steve said, laser focused on getting the targeted policies that are needed to make them take off the ground. So such bottom-up thinking is needed to determine the right policy mix. But the policy mix needs to be general enough to not only support those specific projects that you had in mind initially, but also to support a much wider number of projects that entrepreneurs can come up with and that fit into the narrative of green decarbonization, of green recovery. So in my take, a lot of talk has been on EIB and financial conditions. And I would really like to ask Steve and Barbara afterwards to share their view. But my take is that financing conditions are extremely benign in Europe and are going to be benign for the coming years. So we have very low central bank interest rates, and I think it's also in the market relatively easy to get finance. The problem is more expected cash flow of the investment project. So are these projects essentially making money so that investors are willing to invest in them? And for making sure that we get that, what we need is my strong view is that we need that the expected carbon price, not only this year or next year, but for the foreseeable future is much more meaningful than we have today and is extending to all sectors. And we might need some supply restrictions for polluting solutions, so standards essentially. Then such green policies would essentially help to depreciate brown capital more quickly, and that would create the investment demand across the board for all green technology. And now, how do we get there? Well, it would be ideal to guarantee today meaningful carbon prices and decarbonization policies in the future. The Commission is moving a bit in this direction with talking about 2030 target ambition increases and also with the discussions on the Energy Taxation Directive. But I would argue statements by the European Council that this is really the direction of travel would be extremely helpful at that stage to focus everybody that investments today are going into the green direction. And Stephen mentioned fiscal sustainability of all the recovery measures. And here I would argue carbon pricing is an ideal tool. So we calculated if you increase carbon prices in Europe to some 50 euros per ton, you end up with revenues of about 90 billion euros a year, which is not so distant from about 1% of EU GDP. So that would be a meaningful contribution to consolidation. And as closing point, this consolidation need that we might have after the recovery might serve as a credibility anchor for this carbon pricing. So we should announce today that we want to have significantly higher carbon prices, that we embark on substantial decarbonization policies, and that will pull the investments from all sectors into the direction that we want to, and it will indeed create the investment demand that we currently lack. Thank you.
Thank you, Georg, for complementing our previous discussion with this focus on carbon pricing. So we have now the complete, I would say, overview on all the tools available. I would like to turn to the questions from our audience since we have 15 minutes left, and I would like to also engage with our audience, and I see several different interesting questions on Slido. If you have, please go to Slido, and with BAM20 you can also pose your question. The first that I see is from, I think, your predecessor, Stephen, our current colleague at Bruegel, Suman Berry, that asked how can policy compensate for the green paradox of real fossil fuel prices decline as the energy transition progresses? So can renewables keep pace? So this is the first question, which I would group to another question related to let's say, the fossil fuel world, which is what is Shell, but together with Shell, all oil and gas companies concretely doing to green the economy, and what can they do to also be part of the green recovery? Maybe, Stephen, I would start with you, if you agree, and then we can also maybe listen to Barbara, Samantha, and Georg on these 2 points. Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much, Simone, and those who posed the questions, including Simone. So I think the point that Simone raised on the shifting relative prices for energy and what impacts that has on the green recovery, I think are perhaps somewhat overplaying the short run market dynamics into the long run. And here I'd like to circle back to some of the points that Georg made on really the challenge in all of this is anchoring long run expectations around the structural transformation of energy. Georg gave one kind of pathway for achieving that. But I think the conceptual framing of these pathways are quite straightforward. The trick is getting the political economy considerations right, be they the distributional issues that Samantha was rightly emphasizing, or indeed dealing with credibility issues in government policy making and potential time inconsistencies and lack of complete markets, particularly around the future price of emissions. So I think that the answer to Simone's question is really solving Georg's challenge, but I would take a slightly more kind of nuanced approach than Georg was taking to anchoring long run expectations, and on the right end goals for the energy system. And here I would just say we need to look carefully at what's actually happened in the transformation of energy so far, the critically important roles that industrial policies have had at getting the clean technologies out of their formative starting blocks into the marketplace and capable of scaling. And here I think that getting the right sequencing of formative policies, creating the knowledge, the know-how, the capabilities for transforming energy in place, building confidence and shaping expectations, not only in terms of emission pricing, but in what the long run configuration of the energy system might plausibly look like, as a way of accelerating the transformation of the sector. And so I think the key here is getting the right sequencing of policies, the right sequencing of industrial policies, building confidence and creating the political space for emission pricing over time. And I think that would go a long way to addressing Simone's concerns on kind of an adverse short-run shift in relative prices from a green transformation perspective. The second issue is, what are companies like Shell doing? What is the oil and gas industry doing to invest in the transformation of energy? And here I would simply point to quite a few things. I mean, the oil and gas industry, particularly in Europe, has very much helped pioneer the development of offshore wind, which is arguably the most abundant renewable resource base that can be economically monetized, particularly for Northwest Europe. We're involved in building on that renewable resource capability to explore pathways for green hydrogen, for example, in demonstration projects in the north of the Netherlands. So that's kind of on the technology and the upstream side. And of course, on the customer side, the energy end user side, we're working quite closely with both our business and retail customers to help them make better choices around energy. So I think we're very much active participants in investing in the green transformation and helping others make similar investments.
Thank you, Stephen. And I saw that Samantha wanted to also react to these questions, and then we turn also to Barbara and Georg.
Sure, thanks, Simone and Stephen, and also thanks for the question. So we have a process going with federations and unions from oil-producing countries. Stephen, it includes the unions that organize Shell, just FYI, about just transition and the oil and gas and more broadly the energy sector. So it's exactly this question of, what needs to happen in these companies and in the supply chain so that the companies continue to exist and employ people in a world where we're bringing down emissions. And indeed, you have what you pointed out, Georg, you have a short-term and a long-term perspective, right? So the long-term perspective is stuff where, for various reasons, probably because public policy and public investment are not yet aggressive enough, you can't start employing people tomorrow in, for example, producing hydrogen or building more carbon capture and storage units. However, if you were to suddenly increase the aggressiveness of those commitments, I suspect, having worked in an oil and gas company, that you would see companies immediately start to chase those investments and targets, and also start to employ more people. In the short term, there are actually a lot of things that people who until recently were employed in oil and gas can do, and new jobs that can be created for them. Not all those jobs will be in oil and gas, but you need to get people back to work or use income support and training programs in order to have the workforce ready for the point where the new jobs in greener parts of the energy sector exist. And some of the jobs that people can do, at least terrestrial or land-based oil and gas production, are things like capping and remediating old wells and cleanup. Some of those jobs are very suitable. So I just want to say there are a range of things companies can do. With all respect to Shell and other oil and gas companies, y'all are a little timid in your embrace of the green transition, and there are things governments can do to drive immediate and long-term job creation.
Thank you, Samantha. Barbara, Georg, do you want to react, or should we switch to other questions that I see coming up? Georg, are you?
Yeah, briefly on the green paradox question. In general, I agree that the issue of we decarbonize, fossil fuel prices decrease because of lower demand, and because the oil and gas is simply in place, is an issue. So decarbonization will remain probably an uphill battle until the last ton of CO2. But I think in contrast to what the initial papers on green paradox were claiming, I think they underestimated a bit the role of technology development. So the drop in renewables technology in the past decade, the quick increase in electric vehicle technology and improvements there and of their cost competitiveness, and also of batteries technologies, they led me to believe that this green paradox seemed to be possible to overcome on the technology side. On the question of Stephen somehow on the sequencing of policies and the kind of political economy of phasing in carbon pricing. Yes, we have been fighting in Europe for a long time to get still a relatively modest carbon price until now, and it will not get easier because it has cost to the population and to industry. But my argument would be that as a crisis are moments of redefining policy settings. This is a policy setting in which carbon pricing might essentially be on the political, or should be on the political agenda, and mainly because of the consolidation need for fiscal sustainability of the recovery programs, so that we anchor now a future increase in carbon prices by saying we essentially borrow the money today that we invest in recovery projects from the future revenues of carbon pricing. And I would think that this could do much more to a green recovery than many individual projects taken together.
Thank you, Georg. Barbara, do you also want to intervene, or?
Yeah, I can just quickly make my personal experience on this topic. So when I finished my master in engineering in 1994, there were in principle no jobs available for energy efficiency engineers whatsoever, because the oil price was so low, it was about $19. And I think at that time, it clearly had an impact on the appetite to really become greener and efficient. Now, when I compare it to 2020 or what happened in the last 2 years, there is now more and more voices coming from investors, specifically also when we look at the building sector, who say, look, if you invest in an asset which should live for the next 40 years, and to really maintain the value of this asset, you really need to go to a sustainable approach. And this is in principle independent of the oil and gas price in that sense. So from my point of view, there is a clear shift in attitude, specifically also from the financial community towards this topic. And I think that's a positive spirit we really have to use.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. As we are heading towards the end of our panel, I think we can now go back to our poll and see what is the result. So the result of the polling is that according to our audience, the best policy option to deliver a green recovery are green investments, followed by carbon pricing and then green conditionality to state aid. So since the consensus converted on the green investments, let me then, according to the democratic rule we follow, pick up a question from the audience on the issue of investments. And particularly, let me pick up a question from Professor Renilde Wegelers on how to avoid, when picking public investment projects in certain technologies, the negative externality on other green technologies. So to close the panel, maybe a last word to you all. How would you advise policymakers to concretely put in action the green investments agenda they will have to do over the next months and years? Maybe Samantha, do you want to start?
Sure. Two things. I mean, one is that we have to add the social element to investments, which is something that's happening. In addition to what you mentioned, Barbara, investors are also starting to require evidence that companies are actually adhering to basic human rights principles, which include labor rights. And just to mention that the labor movement, we're responsible for some tens of trillions of workers' capital in our pension funds. We're also starting to push that capital towards projects that are supplying good jobs. The other thing is that we know what we need to know actually about what technologies we need to bring down emissions. So the risk of, picking winners, I mean, we know what the winners are. It's not too hard at this point to put money towards them. And so personally, I don't see this risk of crowding out other things that are more promising. We're kind of past that point.
Thank you. Very quickly, Barbara, do you want to make your point?
So I think it's really important that the policymakers are setting clear targets in the sense of efficiency of future buildings. What is the level they need to reach in the next 10 years? What is the level they need to reach in the next 50 years? And this is, from my point of view, a very successful model to also stimulate then this industry. And I think also coming back to the point regarding social, usually those projects require a higher level of qualification of people, and therefore goes really into the right direction from my point of view.
Stephen?
Yeah, just 2 points. One, I think that there is a significant win-win between investments in the recovery, strengthening overall productivity in the economy, and greening the economy. And I think buildings are the classic example, or the strong example of that, particularly once you take into account the shocks associated with the pandemic. And then my second point would be to agree with Samantha's point that that I think the risk of government picking the so-called wrong winners in this is really quite limited. What's come through the innovation funnel is the result of many drivers and many fundamental economic drivers, and I think it's increasingly clear what the feasible set of technologies to deliver the decarbonization of energy are. So I think that risk is quite minimal. So very much agree with Samantha on that last point. So thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. Georg, the last word to you.
Ranil's question is, I find it relevant. I think we have a couple of technology races still ongoing, and if there is massive public support to one technology and not the others, those races might have different outcomes than otherwise. How to deal with that? I think at the beginning, some technology-specific support is sensible. We have seen that for renewables, where technology-specific support, even for different renewable technologies, have helped them to get down the learning curve. But one needs to find an exit out of that point when they are allowed to really be on the market, and then have to compete with all available technologies. And I don't know, we don't have time to explore that deeper here, but I would have questions, because we talked a lot about housing isolation, and I think keeping citizens warm is we still see very different solutions. We have discussions on hydrogen, discussions on heat pumps and decarbonized gases, and so I think this race is not yet over, and we should keep an open mind about supporting that, which should not hold us back from doing a lot of things there. But we should not pick winners.
That's a rule of industrial policy. Thank you very much, Georg. Thank you very much to you all for this hour, which I personally found insightful and useful, and I hope that our audience also found so. Bruegel annual meetings are not over. We have 1 day and a half full of other sessions ahead of us. The next is in half an hour and is devoted to building inclusive future for workers in Europe. So same place, different speakers. Enjoy the future sessions. Thank you again. All the best.